Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to talk about the encapsulation. Encapsulation is one of the four object-oriented programming principles in Java. The definition of encapsulation is an object to hiding its internal data from the codes that is outside the class. Okay. An object can hide its data by making the instance variables private. Okay. Once the instance variables of the objects are private, that means outside class it cannot be accessed directly. And in order to be able to use those private data outside classes in the object, we need to have public methods that can help us to read and write the private data that the object has. And those methods are known as the getters and setters, or they are also known as the accessor and mutator. Okay. So those accessor and mutator, they do have public access modifier because public is always accessible. Regardless of which package or which class that you are in, public is always accessible. And those methods, they will have public access modifier. And the variables, the variables, when you encapsulate them, you will have the variables will have the private access modifier. Private means it is only accessible within the class. And since the objects are created from the class, that means any object that has the instance variable that is private, it is only accessible within the object itself. Other classes, they cannot have direct access to it. Okay. But those getters and setters that we have, it can help us to access and mutate those mutate the private instance variables of the object. So getters and setters, which are used for accessing and mutating the private instance variable of the object. And both getters and setters are public methods used to protect our data and make our codes more secure. Okay. The getter, it is used for reading the private data, the instance variables. It has only one purpose, which is reading the private data only. Okay. And if we need to write the private data, then we have to use the setter. That is what setter is used for. And that's the only purpose of the setter in encapsulation. Okay. And by using those public methods, getters and setters, we are also able to add conditions or restrictions in order to read or write the data. Okay. So whenever there's some condition that has to be checked before reading or writing the data, you may add those conditions in their getters and setters. If there are conditions that has to be checked before reading, then you add it into the getter. And if there are some condition that has to be passed before setting the data, then you will add those conditions into the setter. So basically, by using those getters and setters, we are able to add more restrictions to the data of the object. Okay, you will have more control over the data. You can add the conditions of what kind of data can be assigned to your private data, private instance variable, and when you can read the private instance variable of the object by using those getters and setters. And the getter method. This getter method, when you declare them, you declare it as an instance method. And this instance method, this public instance method, it returns the private instance variable's value. Because the getter is used for read purpose only. Okay. So whatever the instance variable of the object is having, this getter, it must be capable enough to return it. Okay. And this getter, it does not need to pass any parameters because getter does not need any additional information other than the private instance variable itself. So therefore, there won't be any parameter that has to be passed into the getter. Okay. For example, if this is the person class and here if I have an instance variable, in order to encapsulate this instance variable to protect our data, to make our codes more secure, if I try to encapsulate it, I can make the private variable, I can make this variable private. And then in order to be able to read this private data, even outside this class, okay, so I will be needing to generate a getter. So as you can see, getter is a return method. So that's why the return type, it has to match whatever the data type of your private variable is. Every time when you call the getter, it will return you whatever the value is being stored in this variable of the object. Okay. And of course, if there are some conditions before reading, you may also add it in within this getter method. And the setter. Setter is a public instance method and with the void return type, which means it does not return any value at all. Because setter, it only has one purpose, which is setting the value of the private variable. So we do not need to return any additional data from it. Okay. And the setter, in order to set the value of the private instance variable, it has to take an argument. So therefore setter, it passes a parameter. Okay. And then the setter, it is going to assign the given argument to the private instance variable. That is how we are able to set the private instance variable through the setter, because setter, it takes an argument and then assigns the argument to the variable, to the instance variable. Okay. So here is an example of how the setter can be generated. So in this class, if you have an instance variable to make, you can use the private to make it, to encapsulate it, to hide it within the class. And then in order to be able to write this data outside the classes, since it's private, the only way would be through the setter. So we can generate the setter, and setter is an instance method and does not return any value. So that's why the return type of the setter would be void. And of course, setter, it always starts with the name set, and then you will give the variable name afterwards. And in order to change the value of the variable, the new value has to be given in the setter. So this setter, it passes a parameter, okay? And this setter, whatever the argument will be given, that argument will be assigned to the instance variable. That's the functionality of the setter. And of course, if you have some conditions before setting the data, such as, let's say, name cannot be empty or cannot be null, you may also give that condition within the setter. For example, if the given argument is null or empty, we shouldn't even be setting it to the instance variable. Instead, we can give some error message if we want to. So those setters and getters, they will also allow you to add restrictions or conditions before reading or writing the private instance variables. We are going to do practice with the encapsulation. So the encapsulation, the main point of encapsulation is hiding the data and protecting data and make our codes much more secure. Okay, so the object can hide its data by giving private access modifiers to the instance variables. Okay, and if the instance variables that you have are public, that means that there is no restrictions to those data. Any class can directly access them, and any class can set any value to those variables as long as the data type is matching. For example, suppose that in this person class right now we have two instance variables, name and age, and we also have this toString method that can help us to display the object whenever we pass the object in the print statement. And if those instance variables are public, what that means is, whenever I create the object, for example, if I create the object of this person class in the task class right here, okay, since those data are public, that means they are always accessible. And also, if they are always accessible, if other class can have direct access to it, the other class can assign any value to the variables of this object. For example, when I call the name, I can assign anything to it, such as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and also for the age, I also can assign any data that I want. Doesn't matter. Okay. And also, it's also possible that negative numbers could be assigned to them as well if they are public, because there is no restriction. Public means it is very least restrictive one. Okay. And in order to protect our data, to make our codes much more secure, and especially if you want control over those data, then you need to encapsulate them. You need to make sure that the other classes, they will not have direct access to those instance variables. In order to do so, those instance variables, we can declare them as private. Okay. And once they are declared as private, then other classes outside the class, the direct access to those instance variables will be cut. Okay. So those instance variables now, they cannot be directly accessed outside the class. So right now, if I need to be able to use those variables, instance variables outside the classes, the only way would be having some methods within this class that can help me to read and write those instance variables. Okay, and that is what getters and setters are for in encapsulation. So we can generate the getter in order to be able to read, and we can generate the setter in order to be able to write the private variable that we have. So first let's generate the getter and setter for the string variable name, this instance variable string name. So the getter, first of all, it is both getters and setters, first of all, they are public methods. So therefore we use public because we need to call those methods in order to read and write them. So to be able to access to them, we have to make sure that getter and setters are always public and always available for us to access. Okay. And as for the getter, all it has to do is just to return the value of this variable. So the return type of the getter, it has to match with the data type of your variable. So you will give string here. Okay. And then the getter, it always prefer to start with the name get, and afterwards you will give the name of your variable. So my variable name is name, so here I can give name afterwards. And of course, we have to apply camel case in order to make our methods to be readable. So as soon as I read the method name get name, it means that it is going to get me the name of the person. Okay. And this getter, it does not pass any parameters at all. So therefore, you do not pass any parameter. And if there is any condition that has to be added before reading the data, you may add the condition. So here, if there isn't any, then you can just return whatever the value of the name will be. Okay, so this is how we generate the getter for the name. And if I need to be able to set the name as well, I need to generate the setter. So the setter, it is also a public method, and the setter, it does not return any value at all. Because setter will only be used for setting the value of the private instance variable. It is used for updating. So it does not need to return any value, so therefore the return type should be void. And and for the name of the setter, it always prefer to start with set, and then you will give the variable name afterwards. Okay. And the setter, in order to be able to update the name, in order to be able to set the name, the setter, it needs an additional information, which is the new name. Okay. So therefore, in the setter, you can pass this parameter, and parameter name, of course, it can also have the same name as instance, because we are going to use this argument to set the instance variable name. This argument will be used for the name purpose, for setting the name. So if the parameter is having the same name as the instance variable, in order to assign this argument to the instance variable name under this method, I will have to use this keyword and then call the instance variable name. And to the instance variable name, I can assign whatever the argument that is given whenever the setName method is being called. Okay. And of course, if there is some condition that has to be added before setting the name, if there's any condition that has to be checked before setting the name, then you may also add it within the setter. Okay. And once you have the getters and setters for the name, even though this instance variable is private right now, you are still able to read and write the name. So for example, if I need to be able to set the name, right now the name of this person is not set. So in order to be able to set the name, all I have to do is from the person object, I will call it setter, set name. When I call set name method, it takes an argument, for example, Daniel. Okay. This argument that the setter took, it will be assigned to the instance variable name of this object. So this object name right now is set to Daniel. Okay. And if you want to be able to read the name, and of course, you cannot directly read the name by calling the instance variable name, because it is private. Private means outside this class, it's not accessible. So therefore, the only way for you to read that variable will be by using its getter. Okay. So by having those setter and the getter, those methods, we made sure that setter and getters are the only ways that we can read and write this private data. Okay. And if you wish to be able to read and write this private data age, that means you also have to do the same. You have to generate the getters and setters for the remaining private instance variables that you have. And the good thing is in IntelliJ, we do have such a shortcut that can help us to generate the getters and setters that are needed for the private instance variables. So we already generated the getter and setter for the first instance variable, private instance variable name. And for the second private instance variable age, we can also generate getter and setter. By this time, we can use the shortcut. Okay. So in order to use the shortcut, first you need to do the right click and then go to generate. And it will give you the option, generate the getter only or setter only or getter and setter both. So if I want to be able to generate both of them, both getters and setters for the age, then I can select this option. Okay. Since we already generated the getter and setter for the name, in this option here, it did not give us the name, it only gave us the age. Okay. And once you have the getters and setters for the age, you can also set the person's age by calling the setter. Okay. And if you need to read the data, read the age of the person, then from the person object, you can call the get age. So getter is for reading, it will return you a value. If it returns you value, of course, you can pass it in print statement. And as for this setter, it is used for setting. Okay. And the benefit of using those getters and setters is you can also add conditions if there is any condition that needs to be checked before reading or setting. You see, because you made those variables private. Private means the only way now for the other class to access them would be through the getter and setter. And whatever the conditions that are passed in through in the getter and setter, those conditions has to be checked as well. We are going to talk about why we need encapsulation. So the encapsulation, it can help us to protect our data and to make our codes much more secure. And we can hide the data with an object by giving private access modifier to the instance variables. That way, other classes, they will not have direct access to those instance variables. Okay. And plus, private is more restrictive access modifier than any other access modifiers. Okay. More restrictive means you will have more control over the data. If any condition that has to be implemented or checked before reading or writing the data, you can do so when you apply the encapsulation. So here, for example, you see we have those two instance variables that we encapsulated and we generated the getters and setters. So the only way to access to those two instance variables outside class would be through the getters and setters. And since those getters and setters are block of methods, if any condition that has to be given before setting or reading, then we can check the conditions in those blocks. Okay. For example, if you did not apply the encapsulation, suppose that if those variables were public instead. Public is the least restricted access modifier. Okay. It is less restrictive than private. So what that means is that any class, they have direct access. And if any class have direct access, then they can assign any value to those variables. For example, when I call person1, the name I can set to, for example, empty string. You see, name is empty right now. And when I call the age of the person, since it's public, I can have direct access to it, and then I can also set some negative numbers if I want to. You see? So right now, if those instance variables are public, you cannot give the restrictions to those instance variables. For example, you cannot give condition of if the age is -10, do not set it. You cannot do that because these are public. But if you make them private instead, okay, if you make them private, once they are private, that means those direct access will be cut. And the user, in order to set the age and the name, the user has to go through those getters and setters of this name and age. Okay? And if there is any condition that has to be given, that has to be checked before setting the name or before setting the age, you can give those conditions in their setters. Okay? For example, let's say before setting the name, I have some conditions such as name cannot be empty or blank. Okay, so therefore what I can do is I can create this if condition before in the setter before setting the name, because the setter at the end, it is going to take the argument and assigns it to the instance variable. Okay, so before it sets the name, I can add this condition: if the name is not empty. If the name is not empty, then I want to set it. Okay, but what if the name is empty? If the name is empty, then we should not be setting it. Maybe we can display some error message by using this print statement: invalid name, or name cannot be empty. Okay, and after this error message is displayed, if you expect the program to be exited, in order to make sure that the next code fragment will not be executed if this error occurred in the program, then what you can do is you can give this exit method to exit with the status code 1. Status code 1 means something unexpected happened. If it is 0, that means it exited without any issue. Okay, so you see right now, this is the setter that I have. And this is the setter, this is the only way for the user to set the name. So if the user has to set the name now, user has to call the setter to set the name. And if the user tries to give some empty names, then it will not be set. Okay, it's just going to give me name cannot be empty. So when I try to print the name afterwards by using the getter, see, it printed name cannot be empty because you set some empty data, empty string to the name. So we give this condition in the setter. Therefore, every time when the user has to use the setter to set the name, this condition has to be checked every single time as well. So we just give some restrictions, some conditions for setting the name. And we can also do the same for the age. For example, I need to make sure that the age of the user should never be set to negative. Because right now, if I call this set age method, and if I pass this -10, and when I read the age, it will also give me -10. Okay. Because of this set name earlier, it was set to some invalid data, so that's why it gave me this error message. Let me give some valid name, then the name should be set. So this is name. And after setting the name, then let's set the age. And then print the age afterwards. See, name is set to Daniel and age is set to -10. I don't want this age to be set to -10. When I call this get age, it should not return me any negative numbers. So therefore, I have to make sure that the set age method, it is able to check if this argument is valid. Okay. So in order to give restrictions to the age, to the instance variable age, before setting, I need to go to the setter of the age. So in this set age method, I can create this condition if age is less than 0. If it is negative. If it is negative, then I can display this error message, invalid age. Okay. Or age cannot be negative. And also concate whatever the age that user passed. And then after this error message, to make sure that the next code fragment will not get executed when this error occurred, I can exit the function. Okay. So now when I run it, you see after I added this condition, every time when the user has to set the age, user has to call the set age method. And every time when the set age method gets executed before setting the age, it is going to check this condition. If this condition is met, okay, if the age is invalid, then it's going to exit the function. It will not set the age. But if the age is valid, that's the time that it is going to set the age. So now if I run it, I will not get -10 for the age. Instead, it will give me age cannot be set to negative. Okay. So now the only way for me to set the name and age would be by using their setters. And when I use the setters, the conditions that I give in the setters will be checked. So that way I can make sure that not any types of data will be set to the name and age. And of course, if there are some conditions before reading the data, you can also add the conditions in its getter. Okay. For example, you see here this getName method, it is returning me the string object that is assigned to this variable name. And suppose that when I call this getName method, I have to make sure that the name is set. If the name is not set, this getName method, it should not return me null in. Okay? Because if I get null for the name, most of the time there is a chance that I will be getting null pointer exception. So therefore, when I call this getName method, I can add this condition. The name should not be empty. So if the name is equal to null, if the name is set to null, for example, then I can display this error message, name must be set or cannot be null. Okay. So for example, suppose that right now, once this object is created, name is not set in this object. And when I try to read the name, instead of giving me null, this time it's going to give me name must be set. Okay. And then of course you see a null is still printed here because after this name must be set is printed, we have to make sure that the next code, it will exit. Whenever this error is occurred, let's say I want to exit the program. So to exit the program, you can also give the exit method. Okay. So that way, whenever the name is not set, when you call the getter, it is going to give you this error message. Instead of giving null, this time it's going to give you this error message. So anytime if you want to add conditions before reading or setting in the encapsulations, you will be able to do so. Anytime when you want to give conditions or restrictions to the instance variables, through the encapsulations, it is possible.